Welcome everyone to our session today where we're going to be talking about UiPath Mainframe integration and how to optimize automations that reach out to the mainframe. And you all are going to hear from a couple presenters. I'll introduce them right now. Presenting today is Stephen Gerhardt, who's the CEO and Managing Partner of elementBlue, and you'll hear from Stephen in just a moment. He's going to tell you a little bit more about the work of elementBlue. Also joining me today is Russ Tubner, the CEO and co-founder of HostBridge Technology. And I'm Jerry Rackley, and I work at HostBridge. And we will visit with you today on this topic. And I want to encourage you, as we go through this presentation, you'll see that we have some resources available for you, but we would love to hear from you. If you have questions, you should see at the bottom of your console, there's a Q&A, and there's also a chat capability I think you have at your disposal, and we'll monitor that as we go throughout our session today. So let me allow Stephen first to go and tell us a little bit more about elementBlue.
Yeah, hey Jerry, hey Russ, great to be with you guys today, and for everybody to be attending here. We've just had such great response from this, so thank you guys for hosting at HostBridge and our partnership there that we're attacking this problem. You know, elementBlue's been a technology consulting firm that has a 20-year history. The first 10 or so years of our business, we were very IBM focused, and so the synergy here from our practice in the last 3 to 4 years of being focused in automation is a lot of from our heritage of IBM and mid-range systems and middleware that we were doing is just a perfect union for solving some of these challenges. You know, today we are a UiPath Certified Services Network partner, which is you know, businesses at the front of their game in terms of the UiPath network and in RPA space. And we've got some history in other RPA, but today we're centered on that partnership, and our goal today is to help UiPath customers implement their technology, and specifically in this middleware business problem that we'll talk about today with the mainframe.
Good morning, everyone. This is Russ Tubner. Stephen, thank you very much for that introduction for elementBlue. It's a pleasure to be in partnership with elementBlue and bring not only integration, modernization, and integration technology, but also the kind of technology consulting services that you provide. For those on the call, HostBridge Technology we are a software product company. We design and develop high-performance mainframe integration software. We focus on application integration between large corporate established mainframe applications and allowing them to be integrated with various types of distributed technologies in the most performant and scalable fashion possible. We've been in business for quite some time. We're known for many things, but perhaps most of all, we're known for pioneering the use of server-side JavaScript on the mainframe as a means to effect, again, performant and resilient integration. Jerry, back to you.
All right. Well, one thing I do want to point out is that the presentation you're going to watch today is really based on the guide that is available to anyone for free. And it's a free download. We've got a shortened link on the screen. There's also a site, elementBlue is hosting this document as well, this ebook. You can get it from their website. But if you can't figure out either of those two things, just shoot an email to us, info@hostbridge.com. We will gladly share the link where you can get this ebook. And I will also try and put it into the chat session if you want to go grab it there. So that is the source material for our presentation today. And so let's begin with kind of talking about how this guide came into existence. And Stephen, I'm going to turn to you and have you kind of talk a little bit first about you know, what automations going to the mainframe, you know, how they're built and what they do.
Sure. So, and I would imagine most of our attendees here and those on the replay would be somewhat familiar with these two platforms. But by introduction and just a base of technology and terming the problem here of what we're trying to solve for, really at a default, UiPath and their platform unique in that they provide a terminal wizard. So if you want to go and connect to CICS applications sitting on an IBM mainframe, the developer would open the development studio. They will show some of this in a palette form in their IDE, specifically in a few screens. But essentially, you're going to open a way to emulate the screens you're going to navigate. And sometimes we call that just screen scraping, right? So by default, I'm going to go into the UiPath Studio. I'm going to basically launch their terminal wizard. I'm going to walk through some actions and record those actions for the bots to automate that process through the screens. And that's going to be translated into a markup language called XAML. And that XAML is a standard, obviously produced as an open source type of Microsoft technology many, many years ago. But again, a nice base application markup translation file that you can edit. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics of that later as to pros and cons. But the essence is UiPath is there to make it easy as a default interface to these applications, and in doing so makes it quite easy through their terminal emulator. And we'll talk about some of the pros and cons in that as we get in further to this.
Yeah, I might just add to that the terminal session wizard that is part of UiPath. I've used it quite a bit. It kind of sets the standard almost for doing that sort of activity within an RPA context. However, it's important to note that even though it's very clean and it works very well, it is still interacting with these mainframe transactions on the basis of screens, and the information being gathered off those screens is denoted or specified in terms of rows and columns and the length of a field. And whenever that happens, whenever integration is based on row column geometry of a screen, things can break. So one of the things as we approach this topic of really bringing high performance mainframe integration to UiPath is we want to make sure we can solve for that issue. We want to make sure that we can overcome the issues, the potential breakage that can occur as those mainframe apps continue to evolve.
There's another issue, Russ, I know that you want to talk about right now besides just the brittleness of screen scraping.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen, in fact, we've seen this occur many times over the history of integrating distributed technologies with the mainframe, is that we see this impact of what we call screen scraping at scale. Now, it looks like the green line got offset a little bit, but this graph represents actually a conversation I had with one of our customers about 1.5 years ago, where they said, look, Russ, here's the thing we're struggling with. Our business is growing nicely. Our business volume, whether you describe it in terms of orders or revenue or whatever, it's growing nicely. But as our business volume grows, what we're seeing is our mainframe transaction volume somewhat growing asymmetrically to that. And their question was, what's up with that? Why is that happening? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But that is, in fact, or can be a leading indicator that there is automation occurring in the distributed side of the organization that is perhaps driving mainframe transaction volume up in an undesirable fashion.
Yeah, so I think here just to go back and describe a little bit of looking at how you stitch a process together. We're gonna step back into this technically. Um, through the studio, you have a palette describing this process to the way that the code machine language is going to interpret it and the bot's going to run it. You have a simple palette there in the IDE, we call that a flowchart particular process there that you're looking at. And again, we simply record through the terminal wizard in a default method. We would capture that in a XAML. That's the native stored file. You can debug. You could edit that manually. In fact, if you did a long recording and needed to make an edit somewhere in the middle of that, we describe that in the paper. Some different pros and cons to this. But the essence, and one of the things we want to point out in this, and part of that is somewhat related potentially to this asymmetric increase Russ is mentioning, is the timing delays. I mean, obviously there's a need for that timing delay by some standardization from the way that UiPath needs to provide that utility, from a default standpoint. But it's the RPA developer that should be optimizing that. Number one, for licensing reasons on their own bots, but number two, really for the performance of that impact to the operation. And so what we're finding, what we've found collectively here in the wild is a lot of those defaults sometimes aren't even touched. So that's one aspect of getting into some of the performance issues and some of the things we've discovered here in the short run. We've been doing this. So,
yeah, I might make one comment just to continue to the discussion on these timing delays, and that is that when you actually go through the UiPath terminal wizard and record a session, and then it codifies that in the XAML file, it does insert these very generous timing delays, and it might be half a second every time you extract data off the screen. It might be a minimum of 1 second as you move from screen to screen. Now, it's understandable why they're taking a cautious approach, because when you're screen scraping like that, you really don't know authoritatively the state or status of that application running on the mainframe. The only thing you have to go on are the artifacts on the screen. So they take a very conservative approach, but of course what that does is drive down the throughput and the performance of the overall RPA. One of the things that we did, and you'll read about in our guide that Jerry mentioned, is that we took a common application and used it as a benchmark. It's an application that honestly, IBM distributed with CICS years ago, and it's kind of become one of those standard applications that a lot of people use to benchmark things with. And it's called the Trader application. And so what we did in the guide was actually use the Trader application as our reference point, and we solved what we think is a typical automation process using the UiPath terminal session capability, or we call the default way that UiPath has for interacting with the mainframe. We used that approach to interact with the Trader application to get information, kind of stock price information for 4 different companies. And it involved maybe, I think, about 18 to 22 interactions with the mainframe from log on to log off, and using the default timings, it took a total of 20 or 58 seconds to actually work that process. Now, if someone understands the nature of that application, they can go into the XAML file or use the UiPath graphical editor and change some of those default timing operations or the timing assumptions. But again, out of the box, that particular integration problem would be solved in about a minute. of work performed by UiPath.
Yeah, Russ, and this is not specific to the scope, right? In terms of mainframe, right? As an IDE, as a developer in the IDE on the studio with UiPath, you do this for any application. So it's probably somewhat familiar for most of our audience, but the essence is we've seen a fairly, like you said, generous timing there that you need to optimize at some point in a production scenario.
Yeah, very much. We want to make sure that not only I always repeat two words. We want to make sure that the UiPath bots are highly performant and also resilient. The performance is really this. They need to be performant not only in terms of the real time that they consume, but also performant in terms of the CPU consumption that they drive on the mainframe. We want them to be resilient in the sense that we don't want them to break if or when the application on the mainframe begins to evolve, even if it's as simple as expanding the length of a field. Now, this screen just is meant to illustrate that optimization is possible. In fact, in this particular case, I know this application really, really well. And so I went into the UiPath XAML file, and I did it through a text editor, simply because it's just quicker to make all the necessary changes for me, being fairly technical, to do that. And by tightening the screws down through effective knowledge of the application, I was able to get the UiPath bot to work that problem in about 28 seconds. So, performance, but that's about the best case scenario that one could envision using any RPA platform to interact with this set of mainframe applications via terminal emulation and screen scraping.
Yeah, so Russ, just going through a normal process here, right? We would deploy this into a production environment on the left-hand side of the screen. As many may be familiar, you would deploy this into the orchestrator. That would become available, and maybe it's let's draw an example to a call center application where 20 end users are using this application. So again, going from the fact that now we have a 28-second process, end user request that could be used across many, many desktops in a production level system. I'm now going to send that through either an attended, possibly an attended operation in that particular event in a call center to get and retrieve information out to the mainframe on the right.
Yeah, and this diagram really captures kind of the essence of what we're trying to solve for, and that is that when we're using UiPath to do this sort of automation against the mainframe, it ends up running hundreds or even thousands of transactions per user request. We'll show some analytic tools in a moment that help customers see this activity and be able to assess its impact on the mainframe more precisely. But it's really this explosion of transaction activity that goes from the RPA platform to the mainframe that's a key issue. Every one of those requests requires the full travel of latency, notwithstanding the speed of large corporate networks. If you're trying to run a stream of thousands of these requests to run a bot, latency becomes an issue. And every time we send a discrete request to the mainframe, we have the overhead of handling that input and that output. Just so that we'll show you a slide in a moment of an example of this, but I've seen bots that have been written to run well in excess of 10,000 transactions per bot. Probably the highest, the winner, so to speak, is one that ran slightly over 30,000 transactions coming from the bot. The reason that can happen is not only, well, it can happen in part because of the way the bot developer, whether they do or don't understand the application. But nonetheless, that explosion of transaction activity going against the mainframe is something we're trying to solve.
So here's where we hit the crux of the pivot and solving for it, and that is an opportunity for the RPA developer to use RESTful services, and this is where the magic begins in terms of a solution between UiPath potential development and an offering from HostBridge in a methodology. And that is when we call via an HTTP request, which is a very common activity. We can write into that, some methods or application potential that lives in this at this point through a JavaScript engine that is a HostBridge application, and then actually from that control is kicked off through their application and kicks on the mainframe, and that returns a very precise response, more than running from a front end perspective.
Yeah, we'll show a slide in just a second about how this kind of works from the mainframe's perspective, but from a UiPath perspective, it's just extremely simple. All you have to do is simply drag the HTTP request object over, describe the request that you want to send, structure the data payload, and then it's now in the flow chart, and it just simply sends it over. So it's very, very normal thing to do within UiPath. And notwithstanding the fact that UiPath kind of as a platform comes from a heritage of automating user interfaces, it is an outstanding platform for automating these sorts of API-based interactions with distributed platforms, not just UI-based interactions. Jerry, let's go to the next slide. Now, when that HTTP request comes in from UiPath on the left, what it is being sent to is our server-side JavaScript engine that we offer. And it's not a new offering. It's been around. It is part and parcel of the technology platform of many large organizations around the world. But the value, the solution, the value we're trying to bring here is we want a single request to go to the mainframe, not 10,000. We want a single request going in, and then we want to perform the automation on the mainframe platform, interacting with those applications. So if in fact 1,000 transactions need to be run, so be it. It turns out that's not always the case, but let's just say it is. Then we're going to perform that automation on the platform under the covers of CICS, the Transaction Processing System. And in doing that, in doing that automation on the mainframe, we can improve both resiliency and performance. We'll talk about performance in a minute, but from a resiliency standpoint, since we live on the platform, we are able to interact with that legacy application, that existing CICS application, unchanged on a different basis than you can if you're trying to interact with it from outside the mainframe. When we interact with it on the mainframe, we don't have to reference application or screen data in terms of rows and columns. We get to be able to interact with it on the basis of field name value pairs. And again, none of this requires any changes to those existing applications. So we're able to make it less brittle, or we'd say more resilient, but we're also able to make it far more performant. Let's go to the next slide, Jerry. So that when we solve that same problem with the trader application, and instead of having UiPath do all the individual discrete interactions with the mainframe transactions, instead what we did was we wrote a server-side JavaScript component, very simple JavaScript, it's standard JavaScript, and that actually describes the interaction. So now we had UiPath send a single HTTP request. We performed the automation on the mainframe, and we actually performed the automation on the mainframe, on our little mainframe that we use for R&D purposes, in about 300 milliseconds. UiPath shows that it took about 2 seconds, and that's because UiPath starts measuring time from the point that it began the flow to the time the flow ends. And of course, it had to deal with the latency, not only UiPath overhead, what there is, but the latency of sending the HTTP request up. And then, of course, we processed it in about 300 milliseconds, and then the response came back down, and then it processed it. So UiPath, it says it took 2 seconds. Again, not 58 seconds or even 28 if you optimize it, but 2. And the internal processing time on the mainframe went from a work process from the mainframe's perspective that took 58 seconds to one that took about 300 milliseconds. Again, there are no changes to the CICS applications. This is actually easier for RPA developers to invoke and use, and it is far less impactful on the mainframe. Let's go on to the next slide, Jerry.
Yeah, Russ, here we obviously describe, just in concert with what you're saying, very much a one-to-one service call. So again, looking at it from a UiPath perspective, and on the left side, that attended bot user request is extremely optimized in terms of efficiency, latency, and cost. And there's really not a whole lot of changes, right? It's a change for the RPA developer to be recognized and cognizant of how to develop the application using with a HostBridge service, but in a JavaScript backend. But obviously we summarized here that we're talking about a significant improvement when you're looking at, let's say, expanding that to the call center with 20 users, in fact, that we're all calling that same request.
Yeah, very much. I mean, that this solution then, especially in an attended scenario, if in a call center, if an individual has triggered a bot and it takes that bot 1 minute or 2 minutes or however many minutes to run, then that's not only reflected in the perceived customer service, but it also turns out that it becomes costly all up and down the line. So, but the objective here is to, by taking a different approach to how UiPath communicates to the mainframe, we want to drive efficiency up, we want to lower the latency, and particularly lower the cost, not only from the UiPath perspective, but also from the mainframe perspective. And as you mentioned, what we, instead of encoding or describing the automation process at the UiPath level, we're going to describe that automation process using JavaScript. Our experience so far is that the process of doing that is extremely straightforward, especially if you already have an existing UiPath flowchart that interacts with the mainframe. You've essentially already captured or codified all the necessary steps, and it's really simple to then translate that into the necessary automation steps that to inform the mainframe.
Yeah, one other thought there too, Russ, is and this is capability for any UiPath shop is and what elementBlue is trying to do at this point with some of our customers is building out custom activity wrappers. So to make it even easier, there may be some applications out there where I pre-build in to make a service component, if you will, through a custom activity that the RPA developer can utilize in calling the mainframe application. So we're starting to build some of those out with our customer base now that we're utilizing this approach.
Yeah, and when we look at what our customers are doing or have been doing with HostBridge over the last decade plus with our JavaScript engine, that's exactly what they're doing. They're building APIs for these existing applications, whether they are business logic oriented or terminal oriented, really doesn't matter. We believe that the best practice for mainframe customers with an ongoing inventory of applications running under a processing system like CICS is to begin to put API wrappers around those applications and let that API, not a legacy UI, be the means of interaction.
Mm-hmm. And there's one other thought to this, and that is that a lot of the flows that we build, Russ, we're building that mainframe interaction in amongst other interactions, other interfaces in one particular flow chart, right? Mm-hmm. So some may be thinking, well, I'm kind of starting to bury myself into some middleware development. Then why should I utilize UiPath? But what we're finding is that's just like a tenth or a third of the story when you look at the flowchart mechanism of the automation, right? So that mainframe piece of the automation sits in the middle, while I've got some upstream and downstream actions that I'm automating as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because if we look at what our customers do with our product, I'd say the vast majority are not just getting data from the mainframe. It's that data or that application logic that they're invoking is used in concert with other data and or business logic off the mainframe. And that's a particular strength of UiPath, obviously, in that it can interact with virtually any platform or any data source to actually be that common point that can go to the mainframe, go to the middle tier, go to data, go to particular custom application wrappers that you may have created or maybe even offered by a vendor. Mm-hmm. So it becomes, in a prior era, a number of years ago, we might have even described that same value proposition as being an enterprise service bus. We understand a little bit differently now when we look at it through the RPA lens, but nonetheless, that using UiPath as that pivot point is critical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're going to summarize here in just a moment, share some recommendations and some other resources. Before I let our presenters go through the summary and the remaining material, let me just give you this reminder. We welcome your questions. So if any of the things that Stephen and Russ have discussed so far today has brought questions to mind, please go and enter your questions through the console, and we'll get to a moment here pretty soon where we will go through those. Please continue, gentlemen.
Yeah, so there are a number of ways to try to compare these approaches. We kind of picked performance, resilience, implementation, and mainframe impact. If we use the standard, kind of what we call the default UiPath terminal session approach, we're going to end up with a bot or a bot that's going to be running substantially slower than it needs to run. In our case, we demonstrated that it ran at about 58 seconds. The resilience of that, we judge to be quite brittle because, in fact, the binding relationship between the UiPath bot and the mainframe application is an agreement about row and column geometry, where data is on a screen. The implementation we view to be rather complex only because you do have to go through that recording process. And while it's very straightforward, if you really want to make it fly, if you really want to make it run fast, you enter a degree of complexity that is that's just true. It's just there. And we judge the mainframe impact to be moderate to high, depending purely on the kind of the savvy of the UiPath developer and the volume of transactions. Obviously, the higher the transaction volume, the higher the mainframe impact can potentially be. Now, when we contrast that with an approach using a RESTful service approach, obviously we can demonstrate that the performance of that approach is far superior. The resilience is far better because the integration that we can perform to that application, even though we're interacting with the exact same kind of terminal-oriented or screen-oriented application, when we interact with that, since we run on the mainframe, we don't have to interact with those screens and the data on a row column basis. We get to interact with the application on the basis of field name value pairs. You can rearrange every field on the screen and the integration will not break. The implementation is quite simple. We judge it as simple partly because the integration and the implementation of it is described using JavaScript. And as we all know, JavaScript is probably the most widely known language on earth right now. So finding people in your organization who already have the skill set is pretty easy. We say the mainframe impact is low to moderate simply because we are drastically reducing the number of discrete interactions with the mainframe. That in and of itself saves a lot, both in terms of clock time and CPU time on the mainframe. It also, since we're doing the orchestration on the mainframe, it's actually more operationally efficient. So, and that's partly because the software that we provide running on the mainframe runs on a particular what IBM refers to as a specialty engine. And these specialty engines run, and they have certain names, but they run at sometimes a far higher speed, and the CPU time that they consume does not cost the customer anything additional in terms of IBM license fees. So the objective is to reduce the mainframe impact, continue to use UiPath and RPA as the integration platform, but simply reduce the impact on the mainframe. Stephen, I'll stop there on this one. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Well, Russ, one of the things that surprised me, just to highlight, was that even if you go through as you did to, to whatever degree you want to, the ultimate optimization on the terminal session side was down to 28, 26 seconds or whatever it was, right? We're looking at the opportunity of just using the standard terminal wizard out of the box with maybe a 1 to 2x, multiplier if you're to optimize. But when you look at it from, again, the highlight for me in going through this process was the optimization characteristic of going to 10 or 20 fold or more, right? When you look at the other service. So, huge impact. And, I thought, well, if you get 20% back, great. But we're just talking, exponential differences, and it kind of goes back to that graph of what your initial client was seeing on, business services are growing, but we're not seeing, we're seeing exponential impact into the mainframe, and that's the bottom line. And how were they doing that? Well, they had a very robust and mature RPA program with UiPath, so it was getting hit pretty hard.
Let's go on to the recommendation slide quickly, because I want to get to another slide right after this one. We have two recommendations we bring to you just for your consideration. One is, if you have existing automations, in other words, if you're currently using UiPath and the terminal session wizard to automate the activities of mainframe applications, we have some, we think you need to understand, or we urge you to understand the impact of those automations. And perhaps through that process, identify some automations to optimize. And we'll show you a tool in just in the next slide about how you can do that. For new automations, we would certainly urge that an organization consider using this approach to using a RESTful service that actually resides on the mainframe to be the implementation or the touch point for UiPath. I mentioned that for us, part of our journey with RPA stemmed from a call from a customer where they were wondering about this asymmetric transaction volume. After gathering a lot of data from that customer, we ended up developing a tool to perform Mainframe RPA impact analysis. Jerry? Now, for those of you who come from the mainframe world, I can tell you how we did this. We used SMF data. Particularly, this is coming from a CICS platform, so we use the SMF 110 records. For those of you not familiar with the mainframe world, the so-called SMF records, or System Management Facility records, are informational records that are cut for each and every transaction that runs on the mainframe. And so we performed an analysis of those that data. To perform the analysis, we import that SMF data into an analytics platform. I'm demonstrating the use of Splunk here. And we run through various algorithms and processes that we've developed to be able to look at a given time frame. And this happened to be a 2-hour slice in a given country or for a particular customer. And as you can see, there were a total of almost 250,000 transactions run, and we were able to deduce that almost 200, about 80% of them were being generated by being instigated by some form of an RPA platform. Perhaps the most insightful dashboard in this set is one that lets customers see what we call the DNA of the bot. So if we adopt the language that we're going to use UiPath to build a bot, and then that bot may go through a sequence of interactions with the mainframe, we would call that sequence of interactions its DNA. And so we've developed techniques to be able to take the data, your activity on your system today, and be able to look at it. If you look at this dashboard, the very top line there, and these are sorted, I think I sorted this one by what we call RPA total, and that's the total number of transactions that were executed via this bot. So this bot ran for 599 seconds, 10 minutes. It ran a total of 6746 transactions. It consumed 14 seconds of CPU time on the mainframe, which is a lot. And here's what it did. Here's its DNA. It ran the menu transaction one time, and then it apparently screen scraped or worked its way through a product catalog through a transaction called CTLG 6,745 times. You can see the one below, comparable, but this has a little different DNA. It ran a transaction called ORDR 981 times, went to the menu transaction, and then ran the pricing transaction over 3,000 times. So what we're able to see using this tool is we're able to see what's going on. Our objective, so we have a microscope now, and that's what this customer wanted, and we think is really valuable. So even if you were to never choose to use the HostBridge JavaScript automation engine, which we hope you do, but even if you didn't, a tool and an analysis approach like this is really valuable. Because, for example, when we reviewed this with this customer, and we showed it to their subject matter expert for this application, their first comment was, they don't need to do that. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, we produce that catalog information in a PDF every night. All they need to do is download it whenever they come in the morning. So again, it turned out it was a communication problem. The person who built this bot didn't know that data was available in another form and was automatically produced for them. These are the sorts of insights that we're trying to bring out from doing these sorts of RPA analysis engagements with elementBlue. Let's wrap up, and then if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. We have a few minutes left. Good. What we have seen, based on our experience working in mainframe circles over a long period of time, is that as automation activity scales, specifically as RPA activity scales, when it interacts with the mainframe using kind of these default methods, such as the terminal session method of UiPath, it can have a very negative impact. And what we've learned in interacting with customers over the past year and through our analysis tools, this impact is expensive and it's largely not well understood. The mainframe people might be seeing these transaction spikes, but they look like they're coming from a terminal. They assume that terminal might be a human being. In reality, it's a bot. And so the impact is just hard to see, and it's not well understood. Stephen, I'll let you take it home from here.
Yeah, thanks, Russ. So I look, fantastic. We've had such great response, as I started with earlier, about this topic, and I think it's because we come at this both having common customers, but coming at it from two different angles, at least in the last several years for us, being in the RPA space. Now alignment with UiPath and specifically their tool, and as we looked at the problem, it was like, wow, tremendous, because of our history too of legacy and middleware and IBM. So look, we both have shared this so many times in terms of our natural coming together of this space and solving this problem, but really, for the audience and for those out there, just looking at this technology, you can obviously see the type of payback you can have with common tools and services. We're here to help. We're here to be invested with our customer base and share also in this open community, as is the nature for UiPath as well, by the way. It's such an open community and thought to how to solve common problems like this. So we're happy to be a part of that. And again, happy to know you guys at HostBridge, Russ.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks to both of you. I have the contact information for Stephen and Russ on the screen. I know they would welcome your comments and questions, and let's go to questions now and see what you all are wondering about now that you have listened to this presentation. So the first question I want to ask is, how long does it take to do this mainframe analysis, Russ, that you were just talking about?
Not long. It kind of depends on what we want to understand the particular objectives. We can do it on premises or off. All we need is some SMF data to get started. If we need to drill down to certain bits of detail regarding the application, we might propose installing a bit of software on the mainframe to augment that SMF data a bit. But it's really easy to get started. From the time that we get some SMF data, we're able to start producing reports and doing that analysis usually within a day. So we kind of see this as playing out maybe over a week between the time we get the data and the time that we're able to give back a final report, assuming we're doing it off premises on our systems.
Very good. Okay, now a question that has just come in. I'm going to bring this one up. How does UiPath compare to the RPA product from IBM? I don't know, Stephen or Russ, if you all have any insight into that, but that's the question.
Stephen, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, so IBM has a different approach in terms of their product suite offering, which is really, they encapsulate as a suite called Business Process Automation. They've made some strides in alignment with a particular industry leader called Automation Anywhere. So if that's what you're referring to, really Automation Anywhere has been kind of a central focus for them as an alignment in the vendor space. UiPath is certainly a competitor and has what we feel as some advantages, certainly in the customer base that we're in for picking it. But yeah, that would be my comment. I mean, obviously there's a few others out there in this space as Blue Prism and WorkFusion and others, but all are gonna, fundamentally all are having the same, customers are all gonna end up with the same approach and problem. We have a specific alignment to this problem. But.
Yeah, I think that's really the key point, and that is we have, between Stephen and I, we've looked at a lot of RPA platforms, and they all kind of have this same problem. Their default mechanism for interacting with these screen-oriented mainframe transactions is through terminal emulation and screen scraping. And so if an organization, if a customer tries to scale that up, they are going to encounter the range of problems that we've discussed in this presentation.
Okay, let me ask another question then. And Stephen, maybe this one's you. I'll let you guys decide. What's the difference in time, effort, difficulty using JavaScript to do what we've talked about here versus the UiPath Terminal Wizard and Studio?
Yeah, I think coming at it from just the development time, well, first of all, it's very straightforward, and I think Russ kind of hit this, right? It's one of the, if not the, one of the top three, if you will, most common languages out there, probably in terms of the universe of skill sets and in general scripting language. So it's a natural for those that have that skill to be able to put this in there. The methods itself, right? You have to know the methods of what you're calling. But as far as the studio itself, probably much simpler, obviously, to just throw that web service on the palette if you know what that call is going to be, invoking. The other comment to that is to really look at it as a more holistic approach to the benefits of what you're getting back, right? I mean, the immense amount of payback, even through this new methodology, doesn't even scale in comparison, even if it did take longer. But we've just experienced it's really simple, and it's it's an obviously natural thing and a part of the tool set that's already there in the studio.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question here. So how hard is it to test these RESTful services you've been talking about with some existing automations is the question.
Well, I'll take that. It's quite easy. I mean, having done this, and maybe that's easy for me to say because I've done it so much, but it's not hard at all. In fact, we've worked with a couple of people to even help them use our mainframe to actually kind of learn and explore this approach and do some testing with. But it's really simple. And if any organization, anyone on the call who would like to install our server-side JavaScript engine on their mainframe, we're happy to provide demonstration copies and licenses for people to evaluate the technology. We actively promote that.
Okay, yeah, I think we may have another question. I see some hands raised, virtual hands raised in our panel, but if you do have a question, if you would, please either type it into the chat or type it into the Q&A box, and we'll answer those as we have time. Okay, here's one that has just come in. Similar to a previous question that was asked, creating a screen through screen scraping can be immediate. Won't it take longer to create a screen using a JavaScript? Isn't it manual to do by JavaScript? That's the literal question.
Interesting question. When we say creating a screen through screen scraping can be immediate, you know, I suppose, yeah, I understand that. But when you use the UiPath terminal session wizard to actually model the interaction with those transactions, you are taking time, you are doing that interaction, and UiPath is recording that, and then you typically go back and do a lot of editing to that recording. That takes time. When you develop a piece of JavaScript using our Studio component, you're also going to do the same thing. You're going to walk through that transaction. But as you walk through that transaction, we're not recording where screens are in terms of rows and columns. We're recording the names of those fields on the screen. And then similar to UiPath, after the recording process, we're then going to either generate for you or then give you the information to actually author and edit a bit of JavaScript. So the work processes to do this are similar. There's the sense of instant gratification that you get from the UiPath terminal session wizard is also true when you're using the HostBridge JavaScript engine. We like that we all like instant gratification. And so we made sure that as you're developing that integration component in JavaScript that runs on the mainframe, that you also have the ability to rapidly test and easily edit that activity.
Yeah, Russ, I can see the miss here, and I think the question is very specifically about HB.js and basically getting that component to run and then be called by the HTTP web service, right? So, you know, I think he answered it well, but I can see where we may have where the question came from. Yeah.
You know, there's one other question that sometimes comes up, and it kind of goes like this. It's like, you're talking about running things on the mainframe, and many organizations are concerned about their mainframe MIPS consumption. And why would they want to do that? Well, and that's why I mentioned earlier. When you're performing automation on the mainframe, the way we do it, all of our CPU time, all of our MIPS, so to speak, are run on a specialty engine called a ZIP, ZIIP. And organizations, first of all, ZIPs run typically faster than their normal non-specialty engines on average. But then secondly, there are no additional IBM software costs for any MIP run on those specialty engines. So by moving the integration onto the mainframe, the cost profile for that mainframe, for the mainframe, does not go up. It's not more expensive.
Well, that's perfect because we have run out of questions and we've also run out of time, and that's exactly how we'd like to do it. I want to thank all of our attendees who stayed with us throughout the presentation. As I shared, I know Stephen and Russ would both welcome your feedback and your questions and further discussion, so reach out to them using their contact information that's on the screen. And I want to thank our presenters, and if there's anything we can do to help you with your automations, please let us know. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.